July 2008, in the heart of Melbourne, a group of men embark on a deadly mission to kill a fellow criminal. They work for one of the most secretive and powerful mafia organisations in the world, unaware that police are watching their every move.
We became aware that they were in possession of handguns, of firearms, which gave us rise for concern, and it became very clear to us that they were allegedly embarking on a mission to go and do someone some significant harm. They were going to kill someone. That's certainly the allegation.
Among the conspirators was Frank Madafri, a suburban greengrocer with a reputation as a violent underworld figure. Police phone taps recorded him threatening another criminal over a drug deal.
E ti dice che si può dire si piglia un fucking tambuto e mo su fucking presente che vai orare e tu con fucking capo quello giava e mo fucking piglio e mo fucking levo.
Well, certainly he was regarded with a degree of trepidation, with fear, with respect. His reputation for violence obviously had been established.
Detective Superintendent Matt Warren and his federal police team had accidentally stumbled across the murder plot as part of a top-secret organised crime investigation. They faced a terrible dilemma as they watched events unfold. The police would have to intervene to prevent any killing, but that would force them out of the shadows, blowing many months of painstaking surveillance work.
Myself and the team had been living and breathing this investigation for months, and so for that to come unstuck at that point would have been devastating, really almost heartbreaking for the team and I, really.
The would-be hitmen never completed their journey.
Yeah, right, I'm getting all this on video.
Constantly, and so they've attached the jumper leads to both vehicles.
Their car broke down and they regrouped, still unaware that federal police were shadowing them. The surveillance was part of a much bigger operation, which would ultimately expose the Calabrian Mafia's powerful Australian network. It began a year earlier, when police made a massive discovery on Melbourne's docks. Did you have any idea how big the importation would be?
Not at all. In fact, it was a surprise to everyone. As we unpacked the container, just the volume of drugs we were looking at.
Police had uncovered the world's biggest ecstasy shipment. More than 4 tons of the drug, hidden in a container of canned tomatoes that arrived from Italy in June 2007.
The quantities of drugs were enormous. The amounts of money that were at stake were enormous. It painted a picture of a well-organised group with international connections.
None of us expected that we'd be on for the next 13 or 14 months of hard slog investigating an enormous organised crime enterprise. Then you started to see the whole thing coming together.
Police focused their surveillance on the man they suspected had brokered the massive drug shipment, Pasquale Pat Barbaro. Police suspected Barbaro was a member of a feared and highly secretive international mafia syndicate known as the 'Ndrangheta, or Honoured Society.
Now we've got Pat out wearing the green T-shirt.
For months, police secretly filmed Pat Barbaro meeting associates in restaurants, parks and fruit shops in Melbourne, and even at a farm near his hometown of Griffith in western New South Wales.
Certainly what we saw with Pat Barbaro was that he was the point man for the Australian end. He was the one who was actively involved in talking to the syndicates overseas, in meeting with them.
Of all his criminal associates, it soon became clear that Pat Barbaro treated suburban greengrocer Frank Madafri with an unusual degree of respect. One tapped telephone conversation revealed that Frank Madaffri saw himself as the group's Melbourne boss.
Non continuare sa con mia, capisci? Non mi pare che fucking merda tu fucking toy, non fucking senti, ma ne sono fucking rocco. Ah? I'm a fucking responsible per fucking merda. Merda tu meo e non è ti fucking Pascali.
I think it shows that in his mind, he was the number one Ndrangheta figure in Melbourne, that it was his patch, it was his turf, and that whilst Barbaro was able to operate there in relation to what he was doing, it had to be with his permission and with his knowledge. So I think unquestionably he viewed Melbourne as his patch.
As the surveillance continued, other men came into view. This is Frank Madaffri's elder brother, Tony. Tony Madaffri is a multi-millionaire businessman who part owns a national chain of pizza restaurants as well as several fruit and vegetable shops around Melbourne.
Is it fair to say that Tony Madaffri was deeply connected to these organised crime figures?
Well, certainly he's a very strong associate, absolutely.
On a weekend in March 2008, police were watching when Tony Madaffri met Pat Barbaro and two other drug traffickers in Melbourne's Flagstaff Gardens. It's never been established that Tony Madaffri is involved in drug trafficking, but his meetings with drug importers aroused police suspicion.
Tony Madaffri appears throughout the court allegations as somebody the group consistently sought to meet with in private, Crown Casino or in the villa, the Flagstaff Gardens. What was his role throughout the operation?
We would say that he was an interested party.
Many of the men being tailed by the federal police had begun their careers here, at Melbourne's wholesale fruit and vegetable market. Police discovered some of their targets would meet at the market to have private discussions.
They're able to conduct meetings with very little chance of the police being able to intercept those conversations in that very busy market environment. So it allows them access to other members of the group whereby it's mixed in with normal activity. I mean, these people are continuing to run successful farming operations, so their attendance at the market may not in fact be on any particular occasion criminal, on other occasions it will be.
For decades, the Ndrangheta controlled the market through a cartel that monopolised the sale of produce through bribery and extortion.
Neighbours I have spoken to today tell me that they heard two shots at about 2:30 in the morning.
The Ndrangheta's secretive market cartel only became public when power struggles within their ranks sparked outbreaks of murder and violence.
The explosion occurred just after 6 o'clock this morning during a busy trading time at the wholesale market.
In 1983, the car of the undisputed Melbourne godfather, Liborio Benvenuto, was bombed in the market car park.
When the explosion occurred,
Might be the petrol tank.
you don't think somebody put a bomb in your car?
No, because I never got no enemy.
You've never been involved in any trouble here at the market?
No, never in my life. Never.
A top-secret National Crime Authority report obtained by Four Corners found that the violence was connected with the alleged secret commission and extortion schemes which were operating at the markets.
This group was the so-called honoured society.
Well, that's what they might have called them. I never used that expression, and we didn't. Our company never used that expression. We just used the expression, they're a bunch of ruthless merchants.
How corrupt was the system?
It was rotten to the core.
Fruit and vegetable wholesale king Frank Costa saw the cartel in action.
What was happening was that they had the buyers of certain products, major lines, big volume, in their pocket. And those buyers would give them the order regardless, and it would get through quality control regardless, and they would receive weekly, I think it was mostly weekly, might have been monthly in some cases, but mostly weekly, a brown paper bag. So he might just get 100 boxes of something or whatever, and then he'd give him 50 cents a box, $50 at the end of the week. That would grow to 1,000, grow to 2,000. And the guys got hooked, absolutely hooked. And once you're hooked, you're gone. And you sell your soul to the devil, well, you become a devil.
In the late 1980s, Frank Costa agreed to a request by the supermarket chains to confront these schemes and end the market cartel. Before long, he received a chilling message from a Calabrian wholesaler.
I've been sent to speak to you from so-and-so, who came and approached me this morning in the market with 2 offers. Your choice, Frank, he said. You can have $1 million cash now. It'll be all cash, and you can get that same repeat every 12 months if you let the buying go back to its original process, right? And if you don't want that, you can have the other offer, which is a bullet for you. That was me.
Frank Costa stood his ground with an audacious bluff.
And I said, really? I said, that's very nice of him. I said, you go back and tell that bastard tomorrow, and don't soften that at all, that if one hair of the head of any of our family is touched in any way, double that will happen to his family immediately.
Frank Costa remembers Tony Madaffri as a key market figure, but says Madaffri never threatened him. But later, as a new wave of violence erupted at the markets, Tony Madaffri would face serious accusations at 2 separate inquests.
Of the many startling allegations made during the 10-day inquiry, probably the most shocking was that Tony Madaffri, a Glen Waverley greengrocer, was the Honoured Society's executioner.
In 1991, greengrocer Tony Peluso was killed outside his home in Glen Waverley after a price war with rival grocers. A year later, another fruiterer, Alphonse Muratore, was also shot dead. At the coronial inquests into these unsolved murders, Tony Madaffri strongly denied claims by witnesses that he was a mafia enforcer.
Detective Sergeant Chris Enright told the inquest police had evidence Mr. Paluzzo was threatened by rival businessman Tony Madaffri a week before the shooting. The threat included a warning that if Paluzzo wasn't careful, he would be killed. His son, Gaetano Paluzzo, heard Madaffri say, "Be careful, I'll get you. If you don't, I will kill you."
Murder victim Alphonse Muratore's girlfriend told the coroner that Muratore was convinced Tony Madaffri had killed Peluso. She also said Muratore told her Tony Madaffri was a man to be greatly feared.
I know that in my heart, Fons is on the stand with me all the time. He's there with me all the time, and I'm speaking for him, and I'm not going to stop speaking for him until the day I die, if it needs to be. I want the truth known. I really want the truth known.
No adverse coronial finding was made against Tony Madaffri, and he was never charged with any crime. He denied any wrongdoing, telling police he was simply a man who is very respected at the market. Tony Madaffri's lawyer dismissed the claims against him as baseless hearsay.
He is devastated. He's totally shocked by the allegations that were made. His family has suffered enormously. His business has suffered, and he is very concerned to attempt to clear his name.
In 1995, the National Crime Authority completed the biggest mafia inquiry in decades, codenamed Cerberus. Four Corners has obtained the confidential Cerberus report, which was never publicly released.
Antonio Madaffri has been named by 3 sources as being a member of the Honoured Society. Membership of a secret society must be considered as highly probable.
The origins of this secret society lie on the other side of the world. Calabria, at the southern tip of the Italian mainland, is the birthplace and traditional stronghold of one of the world's most feared mafia organisations, the 'Ndrangheta, or Honoured Society. Behind the picture postcard scenery is a dark history of violence, fear and secrecy.
The 'Ndrangheta has built its reputation on violence. It's especially in the 70s, 80s and 90s, so right at the beginning of its empire of drugs, in order to keep the intimidation and to keep the fear and to keep the social control.
Fighting the mafia here is a risky business. In order to meet one of the top anti-mafia prosecutors, we are escorted by his armed security detail, who must protect him from assassination around the clock. Roberto De Palma says the Calabrian Mafia has built a powerful base in Australia.
Nice to meet you and you're welcome.
No, thank you.
Allora, i legami tra l''Ndrangheta calabrese e l'Australia sono forti, ma non deve assolutamente meravigliare, perché noi troviamo l''Ndrangheta come una dimensione ormai mondiale. Il flusso migratorio degli italiani in Australia è storicamente un dato assolutamente importante. E quale migliore situazione se non ricreare la Lidl Italy anche in Australia con le medesime dinamiche virtuose ma anche viziose.
The Calabrians entrusted the world's biggest shipment of ecstasy to the Australians, 15 million pills. What does that say about the essence of the relationship?
Significa che la circostanza che sia stato scoperto un carico di estasi così significativo ed importante affidato dai calabresi agli australiani non fa altro che mettere in evidenza che in Australia esiste quantomeno un'organizzazione criminale che professionalmente lavora in maniera adatta e adeguata nel campo degli stupefacenti.
At Calabria's container port, Italian police regularly seize massive hauls of cocaine bound for markets in Europe and Australia. But it's just a fraction of the 'Ndrangheta's lucrative global trade.
Rappresenta in questo momento la potenza mondiale più importante nell'ambito del traffico delle sostanze stupefacenti, soprattutto della cocaina.
The birthplace of the Calabrian Mafia is in the foothills of the rugged Aspromonte Mountains. Here, the Mafia remains all-powerful.
There is the code of honor, meaning that if you break the secrecy code, obviously someone has to do something about you. So if you should be killed.
Calabrian-born Mafia expert Dr. Anna Sergi is our guide as we travel to the tiny mountain village of Apido Mamertina. It's a notorious 'Ndrangheta stronghold. It's also the ancestral home and birthplace of Frank and Tony Medafri, the brothers who would later attract so much police attention in Australia.
Would Frank Medafri still have strong connections to the town?
Yeah, that's absolutely expected. That's the one thing that has always been clear to the authorities in Italy, in Calabria, in Reggio, is that for the Australian organisation of Calabrian origin to exist, there has to be an approval from here.
You don't have to look far to see evidence of links to Australia. Tony Medafri left here as a teenager, but Frank stayed behind to establish his criminal reputation.
Francesco Medafri started his criminal career very young from what we see from his record. We see someone involved in violent acts.
This is the area where Frank Medafri was blooded as a young mafia soldier. Aged just 19, he was caught by police, acting as a bagman in a violent extortion scheme. The scheme involved blowing up the house of the victim and demanding a huge payoff. Frank Medafri was caught when he came to pick up the cash.
The traditional code of silence, which has protected the Mafia for centuries, remains entrenched here.
What happens to informers, those who speak out against the Calabrian Mafia here in these villages?
The most common thing that can happen is that someone refuses to pay the protection tax, the racket extortion tax. They attempt to send a message across that if you mess with them, if you refuse to pay, then they either burn your shop or they make life unbearable for your relatives. They make it impossible to find a job for your son or daughter. Some of them have ended up dead. So these rules still apply, but we have less and less visibility of killings because they don't need that. I mean, they don't need the publicity. They are strong enough without it. There are various ways of killing someone, I would say.
So it's over here where the young girl was taken?
Questa è la casa della famiglia Mittica ed è qui che il 28 di novembre del 1986 venne rapita Angela Mittica. All'epoca era una ragazza di 25 anni.
Pantaleone Sergi is a journalist and former mayor of a nearby town. He takes us to the site of a notorious crime linked to Frank Medafri, the kidnapping of a local politician's daughter.
Cronaca, rapimenti in Calabria, ancora nessuna traccia di Angela Mittica.
Angela Mittica's kidnapping became big news in Italy as one of a spate of high-profile mafia crimes.
We've just been told that Angela Mittica might be willing to talk to us. Now, if she goes on camera, it would be an extraordinarily brave move. Most people here are still terrified about speaking openly about the Mafia. Track of time.
At a discreet location, Angela agrees to tell us her story. It's the first time in 28 years she's spoken publicly about her ordeal.
Io ero impaurita, terribilmente impaurita, perché non avevo idea di quello che stesse succedendo. E invece mi hanno detto no, è un rapimento, è un sequestro, insomma, non preoccuparti, non sono altre cose, nessuno ti vuole fare del male, nessuno ti vuole uccidere. È un rapimento proprio per... insomma, a scopo estorsivo, ecco, di denaro, per ottenere il denaro.
Angela Mittica would spend almost 5 months held captive in a cave hidden among the rugged mountains that surround the town. Her captors wore balaclavas at all times, so she would not be able to identify them.
E dunque le condizioni erano proprio brutte, onestamente, anche perché ero incatenata. Avevo la catena al polso e alla caviglia, che erano legate a dei tronchi di albero, perché praticamente in questa grotta, che era molto bassa, infatti io non potevo stare in piedi. In questa grotta c'era soltanto una specie, un materasso, diciamo, di gomma piuma, che era appoggiato non su una rete ma proprio su delle legna. Soltanto poi quando venivano appunto loro me la toglievano, ecco, un po' di tempo, diciamo.
As the search for Angela Mittica continued, local police arrested more than a dozen suspects. One of them was Frank Medafri.
Why did the police arrest Francesco Medafri?
Francesco Medafri fu arrestato nella prima fase delle indagini, quando più forte era la pressione da parte dei carabinieri, della polizia e dei magistrati, perché volevano arrivare a capire e a risolvere questo sequestro di persona. E Francesco Medafri era già noto alle forze dell'ordine per alcuni precedenti e per questo motivo le indagini si concentrarono su un gruppo omogeneo di cui lui faceva parte. Ripeto, con quale ruolo non si sa, però i carabinieri e la polizia inizialmente pensarono, e il magistrato confermò, che lui facesse parte proprio della banda che aveva sequestrato Angela Mittica.
What do you think Francesco Medafri was doing?
Pantaleone Sergi reported on the kidnapping for a major Italian newspaper.
So is this where Angela Mittica was kept?
E dalla grotta, che sarà qui nell'area in cui la ragazza era stata tenuta, la stavano trasferendo in un altro rifugio. Il comando fu intercettato dai carabinieri, nacque un conflitto a fuoco, addirittura i carabinieri stavano per sparare alla ragazza, ma lei ha detto no, che sono io, che sono Angela Mittica, ecco, e allora l'hanno liberata, l'hanno presa e se la sono portati via.
Dopo una prigionia di 130 giorni, la studentessa calabrese Angela Mittica è tornata.
After enduring 130 days in captivity, Angela Mittica was finally reunited with her loved ones.
Con i suoi carcerieri.
E quello penso che sia stato il giorno più bello della mia vita, onestamente.
Cosa pensavo? Meglio che non...
Effettivamente, sì. Ho trovato qualcosa di indescrivibile, ecco. Cioè sapere, ecco, di essermi lasciata alle spalle con quell'esperienza, di essere uscita da quel covo, da quella situazione di vita, insomma, di potermi riappropriare della mia vita, ecco. Può sembrare una stupidaggine, ma proprio di potermi fare una doccia, di potermi fare uno shampoo, di poter rivedere le amiche, il mio fidanzato, i miei parenti, insomma.
Despite his arrest, Italian police were never able to gather enough evidence to charge Frank Medafri over the kidnapping of Angela Mittica. But they did have the evidence to charge him with a litany of other serious crimes throughout the 1980s. He was convicted and sentenced to multiple jail terms for extortion, mafia conspiracy, and 2 separate stabbings, as well as drug and gun possession.
He was arrested and sentenced for stabbing. He was also involved in a kidnapping case. He was involved in, he was suspected of an attempted murder, voluntary attempted murder, and he was sentenced twice for extortion. This tells us, considering the area he is from, that he was trying to make a name for himself. He was trying to show someone that he could be trusted to carry out certain work.
In 1989, with police again circling him, this time over a prison stabbing and for receiving stolen goods, Frank Medafri fled Calabria. He arrived in Melbourne, lied about his criminal record and was given a 6-month tourist visa.
Well, certainly, clearly he served an apprenticeship and a fairly violent one in Italy before he came to Australia. There were outstanding warrants for his arrest in Italy when he arrived in Australia, which he didn't declare.
In Melbourne, Frank Medafri began working in the fruit and vegetable trade, where his brother Tony was already well established. The violence at the wholesale markets was continuing. Before long, both Frank and Tony Medafri were at the centre of criminal investigations, with police making explosive allegations in a statement later aired in court and fiercely denied by the pair.
Antonio Medafri has involvement in a substantial number of crimes, including murder, gunshot wounding and arson. Frank Medafri, if allowed to remain in Australia, will continue to carry out acts of violence on behalf of a criminal syndicate.
In 1996, Australian authorities moved to have Frank Medafri deported after finally discovering he was an illegal migrant with a lengthy record of violent crime back in Italy.
How seriously did
Philip Ruddock was Immigration Minister at the time.
I do have a view that in relation to serious criminal records that people may have, that they should be taken into account as to whether or not they're able to settle in Australia. And my first presumption is we don't take other people's criminals.
How seriously...
In 2000, Ruddock ruled that Frank Medafri should be deported back to Italy.
If you have a person who comes and, I think in this matter, marries an Australian and then seeks to stay, and there is a serious criminal record, in my view, that should be taken into account. And the view that I formed was that on the basis of the criminal record, he should be deported.
Desperate to keep Frank Medafri in Australia, his family headed to court.
During one hearing, a judge was told that Australian police suspected Frank and his brother Tony were part of a crime family allegedly involved in murder, arson and extortion. The brothers denied this, and one judge said the police view could not be relied on as it was based on unnamed informers. But ultimately, the deportation order was upheld, and so the Modaffris embarked on Plan B. By this time, Tony Modaffri was a wealthy businessman cultivating political links. Among the Modaffri family supporters were several major political donors, such as Sydney furniture king Nick Scali. Liberal Party sources have confirmed that in October 2001, Scali organised a meeting between Tony Modaffri and a New South Wales Liberal Party figure associated with a fundraising vehicle called the Millennium Forum.
When you look at the Millennium Forum website or the way in which it organises functions, the idea is that you would be a donor of a particular value and that would get you so much access, whether at dinners or fundraising events of different kinds. It's access in return for a donation.
It's all about getting the ear of a politician.
Exactly, and nothing else. Part of the purpose of the public inquiry will be to attempt to determine whether or not that innocent explanation should be accepted.
As the counsel assisting the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, Geoffrey Watson recently investigated the Millennium Forum.
On how many occasions would you see it that a donation was quickly followed by a request to meet a politician? Then ask yourself, why is somebody requesting a meeting with a politician? It's not just to get to know them, it's to influence them as to their decision making. Of course there's a connection.
The Liberal Party figure involved in the Millennium Forum arranged a meeting with Immigration Minister Philip Ruddock. Nick Scali arrived at Ruddock's office, accompanied by the Modaffris' family lawyer, who'd flown up from Melbourne.
Were you surprised that a legal representative of the Modaffri family was sitting in your office?
Well, look, I wasn't aware of it. I'd agreed to see a community representative who wanted to put a view.
Liberal Party sources have told Four Corners Philip Ruddock was furious when he realised he was hosting Frank and Tony Modaffri's legal advisor. The meeting was cut short as Ruddock rejected the pleas made on Frank Modaffri's behalf.
Some people wanted to put another view. I was prepared to hear it, but given what I've said to you, criminal records are serious issues, and I came to a view in exercising my discretion that I would not waive the deportation, that it should proceed.
I'll say this about Philip Ruddock. You may not agree with his politics, but he's a man of integrity, and he acted there as I thought he would and he should. But the fact is that his actions showed that he recognised immediately that there was something wrong with receiving these solicitations from the Modaffris.
I, Amanda Eloise Vanstone, do swear that I will well and truly serve the people of Australia in the office of Minister for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs.
In late 2003, Amanda Vanstone replaced Philip Ruddock as Immigration Minister. Tony Modaffri now called on the help of another prominent businessman and political donor to lobby the new minister to have Frank Modaffri's impending deportation overturned. The donor they turned to was Pasquale Pat Sergi. Pat Sergi is a property developer with a reputation for charity work. In 1979, the Woodward Royal Commission concluded he'd been buying and selling real estate using money provided by Mafia drug traffickers.
Woodward found that it was essentially a money laundering operation. It was quite substantial, and certainly by today's standards, we're talking millions and millions of dollars.
What does that say about Pat Sergi's closeness to the Mafia?
Well, they wouldn't have been giving Pat Sergi cash and allowing him to invest it unless there's an extremely trusted person.
The Modaffri brothers and their supporters launched a full-blown political lobbying campaign. Pat Sergi approached New South Wales Liberal Senator Maurice Payne. Other donors lobbied Victorian Liberal MP Russell Broadbent, as well as his colleague Bruce Bilson. In the lead-up to the 2004 election, Tony Madaffri organised a political fundraiser in Melbourne, attended by all 3 Liberal parliamentarians. Each of them had previously contacted Immigration Minister Amanda Vanstone about the impending deportation. The guest speaker at the fundraiser was Amanda Vanstone. On the evening, Tony Madaffri personally donated $15,000 to the Liberal Party's Millennium Forum.
This is a case study of what's wrong with the system. What's seriously wrong. The point is that for no better reason than the making of donations to a political party, specific representations were able to be put to amongst the most powerful politicians in the land. Access which you and I couldn't get, except if we made substantial donations ourselves.
By 2004, Tony Madaffri was a regular at Liberal Party fundraisers, including this function with then Victorian opposition leader and now Melbourne Lord Mayor Robert Doyle. Searching through hundreds of photos from fundraising events, Four Corners discovered Tony Madaffri even meeting then Prime Minister John Howard. In November 2005, after years spent lobbying, Frank Madaffri finally got the break he was looking for. Amanda Vanstone intervened in the case and overturned the deportation order. Amanda Vanstone has not responded to repeated attempts to contact her, and all the MPs involved in the lobbying declined to be interviewed. But they've maintained their intervention in the case was based on humanitarian concerns about the impact of the deportation on Frank Madaffri's family. Why did you feel it? Senior officials who worked on the Madaffri visa case have told Four Corners the decision to overturn Ruddock's deportation order was appalling, as it exposed the community to harm. Do you stand by your decision that you made as Minister in the Francesco Madaffri case?
Look, I wouldn't be here talking to you if I didn't believe that weighing up all of the issues that were before me at that time, that it was the appropriate decision.
Should Frank Madaffri have been given a visa?
Well, that's not really a question for me to answer. However, on the basis of the fact that he had significant criminal convictions, certainly he's not someone that we would recommend would be given a visa to reside in Australia, for sure.
Four Corners can reveal that a secret multi-agency police report found the Madaffri visa case highlighted the insidious ways the Mafia enter the social or professional world of public officials and through legitimate processes achieve influence.
There is no suggestion that Vanstone acted corruptly, rather that members of the Italian community, including 'Ndrangheta members and their families and associates, are likely to have ingratiated themselves with her office, and that through their legitimate public face were capable of achieving influence.
The Calabrian Mafia doesn't give anything away. Any cent they spend is because they expect 2 cents back. Now, in this case, what they were doing were making an investment in political connections to try and build up pressure to have it overturned.
After winning his battle to stay in Australia, Frank Madaffri embarked on the boldest chapter yet in his criminal career. In 2007, he was under fresh investigation, this time for his links to the world's biggest ecstasy importation. Police were listening in as he threatened his underworld rivals. Detective Superintendent Matt Warren was convinced that Frank Madaffri was part of the syndicate responsible for the massive ecstasy shipment. But catching him and his accomplices would not be easy and would involve a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game between police and one of the most dangerous mafia groups in the world. The The story of this enormous Australian police operation started in June 2007 with the discovery on Melbourne's wharves beyond all expectations.
At the time of the seizure, it was the largest seizure of ecstasy in the world, and some 15 million tablets were actually seized by the police.
We're talking about 4.4 tonnes of ecstasy, an enormous value of drugs. We're talking about $500 million worth of ecstasy.
The drugs had been carefully hidden inside a consignment of canned tomatoes imported from Italy. Federal police secretly seized the drugs and then put the container back on the wharf, hoping to arrest whoever showed up to collect it. As the shipping container sat unclaimed on the dock, the suspected drug plotters gathered at this Melbourne hotel. They didn't know their hotel room had been bugged by the federal police. As police listened in via a hidden microphone in their 6th floor room, it soon became clear the suspects feared a trap.
If there's cameras there, we could swear it'd be fucking cameras set up as well. This would be nothing to do. Oh mate, you'd have 20 million fucking copies just fucking watching that one fucking way or something.
As days became weeks, with no one arriving to claim the shipment, lead investigator, Detective Superintendent Matt Warren, feared something had gone wrong.
Your emotions are up and down. You know, you've got that constant expectation that someone will come and that you'll get a result. And when that's looking less and less likely, without question, it's disheartening.
Police soon realised why no one had come to collect the container. Due to a clerical mix-up, the drug importers never got the phone call to confirm their shipment had arrived. They had no idea if their container had been lost, stolen or seized.
The number, we would allege, on the paperwork was a false phone that would go to the criminal syndicate, and they would redirect the container to a warehouse under their control. Well, of course, that didn't occur for them. They never received the call. So you had quite a strange situation with a container purporting to be full of drugs sitting in a freight forwarder's yard and no one going anywhere near it.
I think in the short term it looked like a setback to the investigators, because obviously at the start of this investigation they were just probably hoping for a quick result where the criminals would come and pick up the container and they'd move in and arrest them. So initially it looked like a setback, and that meant the investigation had to run quite a lot longer.
In fact, it was a turning point, and it allowed us to go from arresting some of the lower level suspects to move up the chain and take out some of the probably the highest profile organised crime figures in Australia.
The men police had under surveillance were suspected members of Australia's most notorious mafia cells. The man at the centre of the group was a New South Wales mafia boss called Pasquale Pat Barbaro. Barbaro appeared to be the man calling the shots.
He was issuing directives to people in terms of what was to happen within the business. He was very hands-on. I think he was in the detail of this business. He certainly wasn't a hands-off manager. I think the evidence very much revealed him to be very busy, very active, hard-working.
And what we saw was a man who was driven. He was energetic. He would drive their operations. He was very much a leader.
As the suspects discussed what had gone wrong with their shipment, their hotel room conversations were being monitored on a police listening bug. It recorded members of the group discussing whether to storm the Port of Melbourne to find their missing drugs.
I don't know what control they have over the fucking docks there. It's routine. It's all down the map and just say, this is how it is. There's a crane drive on the side. You have to pitch it up, put some of the back on the side. There's no harm down there. And no one's harmed.
For the criminals, they were madly scrambling to try and locate the container because at that point it had gone missing, and certainly it became very clear to them, although they weren't able to confirm that the container had been intercepted.
The listening bug also revealed associates of Pat Barbaro describing his growing fears that either police or another criminal syndicate had seized his drugs.
That's devastating. It's fucking shock. What he's got to realise now, he's got to realise that he's been the drugs.
Our view was that if we continued to investigate them, they would need to talk about the fact that they had not received these pills, that they had lost. They're talking about a huge financial blow to a syndicate. There would be a lot of people who would be owed a lot of money. There'd be a lot of people who would have had an expectation of receiving a lot of money out of this. So therefore, people need to talk, they need to discuss. And that was where we were hoping that we would start to gather some evidence of what had occurred. What I'm saying to you is this is most likely the trafficking.
Police believed if they followed Pat Barbaro, he could lead them into the heart of the secret operations of the Calabrian Mafia. The investigation soon headed to Barbaro's hometown of Griffith in New South Wales, the historical epicentre of the Ndrangheta in Australia.
Certainly in the early stages of his life, he was convicted over a cultivation of marijuana plants, and that's fairly common in the Griffith area. We've seen historically the Calabrian Mafia involved in marijuana crop growing in that sort of New South Wales area, that Griffith general area.
In the 1950s, thousands of Italian migrants came to Australia to seek new lives. Many honest families from the mountain villages of Calabria were drawn to the rich farmland around Griffith in the New South Wales Riverina district. In the decades that followed, a small number of Calabrian migrants began amassing unexplained wealth.
They lived a life that was quite separate to the traditional Griffith resident in that they were building big homes. If it was a dry period, it didn't seem to worry them. They still had the money. They didn't do it tough like many of the farmers and others in Griffith were doing it, and it caused a lot of concern, and I can understand why.
In the 1970s, Donald Mackay, a local furniture shop owner and political candidate, began campaigning for police action against local farmers suspected of secretly growing marijuana. After police busted a huge local marijuana crop, Mackay suddenly became a marked man. In 1977, he disappeared after leaving a local pub.
When these crops were seized, he was blamed for it. That's what caused his murder. He had cost the Calabrian Mafia too much money. It was time to stop. If we can get rid of Donald Mackay, we can get back to growing the crops. That was the simple logic of it. And he appears to have been shot as he was attempting to unlock the car.
Former New South Wales Assistant Police Commissioner Clive Small spent years investigating the Calabrian Mafia.
There was some blood found on the ground here, near the car. There were 3 spent shells, suggesting he'd been shot 3 times. And the keys to the car were on the ground. So that was the last that was seen of him leaving the hotel. Never been found to this day.
Griffith's Calabrian Mafia cell had a powerful avenue of political influence through the local federal Labor MP, Al Grasby. When Grasby visited Calabria as Immigration Minister in 1974, he was treated to a hero's welcome.
I am aware, while he was the Immigration Minister, there were a number of people who got visas and were able to stay in Australia who are of highly questionable character, and I think any reasonable look at them would raise questions about why was that done if it wasn't done for corrupt purposes. I don't think there's any question that Al Grasby was significantly corrupt. His attempts after the Donald Mackay murder to move the blame away from the real killers and make suggestions that Donald Mackay's wife and others were involved in the murder was disgraceful, and I don't think any man with any sort of decency could justify that.
Responding to the public outcry over Mackay's disappearance, the New South Wales government set up a royal commission headed by Justice Woodward to investigate drug trafficking networks.
What's the lighting here?
Clive Small was one of the commission's investigators.
The Woodward Royal Commission was extremely important in two ways. It really opened up the story about the Mackay murder, and in doing that it also opened up the story about the Calabrian Mafia in Australia.
Among the men investigated was a local farmer, Frank Barbaro, nicknamed Little Trees for the new orchards he'd planted.
Well, Frank Littletrees Barbaro was at the core of what you call the Calabrian Mafia group in Griffith. He was one of the first to be growing substantial crops, and he was one of the first, Woodward found, to have significant additional and unexplained flows of money.
This is money from the
money
marijuana?
Coming from the marijuana crops.
Okay.
Frank Littletrees Barbaro had a son he named Pasquale, but who everyone else called Pat. Pat Barbaro learned the family trade.
Pat Barbaro is clearly one of those people that we hear about being classic mafia. That is, he's born into the family, which is already a significant part of the Calabrian Mafia or a family clan. So he's been born into the Calabrian Mafia, into one of the head families.
Certainly, what we see with this is what we've seen historically with the Ndrangheta, that you will have the baton passed essentially from father to son, from father to nephew, and that they will continue to use those very strong family links and will take over essentially the family business.
Pat Barbaro took over his father's business, expanding it from cannabis crops to drug importation.
Here is Justice Woodward in the 1970s warned the federal and state governments and the law enforcement about this threat involving these people. And here we are some 30 to 40 years later, the same families involved in major drugs still from that time. And if you look at Pasquale Barbaro's history, he'd been involved in drugs almost all his life.
Clive Small says that the Woodward Royal Commission's recommendations to launch a long-term anti-mafia campaign were ignored. Soon the mafia faded from public view.
Well, we've had for 16 years a denial that there is such a mafia in Australia, and I think that's part of the problem. If we had admitted that we had a problem with the Calabrian Mafia, the public would be screaming for us to do something about it. If we say it doesn't exist, then we don't have to do anything because there's nothing to respond to. And I think that's the problem. It's been hidden from the public because it's too big a political problem.
According to a secret 2003 National Crime Authority report obtained by Four Corners, police had for several years been confidentially warning that Pat Barbaro was part of a powerful Australian Calabrian mafia network. This network had infiltrated members into or recruited people from public organisations, government and law enforcement. One of Barbaro's criminal associates had even allegedly paid off judges, costing approximately $2.2 million. Barbaro himself was suspected of using the profits obtained from cannabis cultivation to finance the importation of drugs from overseas.
Certainly by late 2006, early 2007, we were well aware of his prominence and that he was extraordinarily active in international crime.
If you have a look at his history, he's been involved in crops in New South Wales, in Queensland, that's cannabis, but then he seems to have moved into other drugs, be it amphetamines, ecstasy and the like.
By early 2007, police were investigating Pat Barbaro over several drug importations. The biggest of them was the world record ecstasy shipment that had arrived in Melbourne from Italy in June 2007 and and which Barbaro had been unable to locate.
This was a continuation of a number of investigations that were occurring. The AFP were investigating and had investigated Pat Barbaro over a number of years. He was alleged to have been involved in a number of drug importations, and we saw him as a major organised crime figure at the time.
After secretly seizing the drugs, police then shifted the focus of their investigation to Italy, the source of the shipment. Four Corners travelled to Calabria, in Italy's deep south, the traditional home of the 'Ndrangheta.
The 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and 'Ndrangheta in Australia are tight, really tight. Even if they migrated 50 years ago, they still are very connected, even in a nostalgic way, to the motherland, which is Calabria. So the links are there, the links are tight, and they are based on the one thing that keeps all the 'Ndrangheta clans together, which is blood ties. The most common thing that can happen is that someone refuses.
Dr. Anna Sergi is a Calabrian Mafia expert who studied the group's links to Australia.
The Barbaro family is one of the oldest mafia families in Calabria. The Barbaro surname is a guarantee for if you want to access certain drug routes, if you want to be involved in certain transnational business.
In July 2007, 1 month after the massive drug shipment had disappeared in Melbourne, Pat Barbaro flew to Calabria. When he arrived in the capital, Italian surveillance operatives working with the AFP were waiting and watching. They tailed Barbaro as he met several known Calabrian mafia figures linked to the ecstasy shipment. The police who trailed Barbaro work with anti-mafia prosecutor Roberto De Palma.
La circostanza che Pasquale Barbaro, venuto in Italia, abbia avuto i contatti con esponenti di altre famiglie, dimostra che la famiglia Barbaro è una famiglia assolutamente di primaria importanza nel panorama criminale, ma dimostra anche un altro fatto, cioè che questi viaggi, che c'è la necessità in fondo di potersi vedere, perché la tecnologia che tanto ha aiutato e ci aiuta in questo villaggio globale che ormai è tutto il nostro globo terrestre, ha aiutato paradossalmente anche i contatti di carattere illecito. E però, ciò nonostante, vi sono determinati argomenti di carattere strategico, di carattere generale, che debbono essere ragionati di persona, no?
Italian police identified another Australian, allegedly working with Barbaro in Calabria, Adelaide construction industry figure Paul Alvaro. Italian police files allege that Paul Alvaro was assisting Pat Barbaro with his drug trafficking enterprise, a claim Alvaro strongly denies.
Sì, la famiglia Alvaro è una delle famiglie di 'Ndrangheta più importanti, ma non solo la famiglia Alvaro, ma anche esempio la famiglia Barbaro è molto presente in Australia, la 'Ndrangheta è molto presente in Australia non solo ad esempio nella produzione di marijuana, ma anche nel traffico di cocaina e anche nell'occupazione della cosa pubblica.
In Calabria, Barbaro's explanation to his mafia bosses about why their drug shipment was missing did not go down well.
Barbaro flew to Europe to meet with the syndicate heads, and by this stage we'd established that there was an enormous debt that was owed and that he would have to pay the bill, or he would be probably held accountable, and within that type of group, the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian organised crime, we would expect that he potentially would suffer the ultimate consequences.
You mean he would be killed?
Yeah, there could potentially be a contract taken out on him.
On Barbaro's return to Melbourne, police continued to watch and record his every move. He was getting increasingly desperate. In this surveillance video, police believe Barbaro was threatening a criminal he suspected of stealing his drugs from the docks.
Certainly there's some friction, and as pressure starts to mount, as disappointment starts to mount, we can certainly see fractions within the group and certainly some bickering, and this is brought about by the enormous pressure that they're under for this to be successful.
Barbaro and his fellow criminals suspected they were being watched and began to engage in elaborate counter-surveillance measures.
Their conversations over the phone or via text message were often cryptic and coded. They would often speak in public areas, for example, parks. Also, this particular group of criminals changed their SIM cards over regularly so that if they thought their phones were being bugged, they would basically just get rid of that phone and move on to another phone.
Barbaro was determined to find out what had happened to his massive drug shipment. So he made a risky move and reached out to a journalist. In September 2007, I received a phone call from a blocked number. The man on the other end asked me if I wanted to report on the world's biggest drug shipment. I didn't know it then, but that man was Pat Barbaro, and he wanted me to confirm that the drugs had been seized by police, and then to report this so it could be read by his bosses back in Calabria. Using a mobile phone registered in a false name, Pat Barbaro sent a series of text messages to spur me into action. The texts were detailed, describing, among other things, the number of pills in the ecstasy drug shipment. Sensing something sinister was afoot, I reported nothing. So a desperate Barbaro sent more and more information. Neither he nor I realised this would later prove crucial to the police case.
Looking at the historical metadata of the phones that had been purchased, we were able actually to put those mobile phones in Barbaro's hand. And those phones sent text messages that were tantamount to a confession.
The SMS messages with you showed that Barbaro had critical knowledge of the contents of that container. He knew exactly what was in the container and he was able to convey that to you in those SMS text messages. So that was a terrific link for the prosecution to have in this particular matter.
In early 2008, Barbaro began to organise new drug deals to raise the cash to pay off the debt from his botched importation.
Certainly within months, the Barbaro syndicate were back in business. They had access to 1.2 million ecstasy tablets, which seemed to originate from Sydney. And really the sale of that 1.2 million ecstasy tablets was then used to pay down the debt to the European suppliers for that missed importation. So very quickly they had regrouped, and obviously their business model was such that they were able to sustain a massive hit to their bottom line.
As police kept watching, Barbaro began leading them to other Mafia bosses. These surveillance photos show Barbaro meeting his drug-dealing partner, notorious Melbourne gangster Frank Medafri. Police suspected Medafri had invested in the massive ecstasy importation.
Medafri was a buyer of ecstasy tablets from Barbaro. Barbaro had a number of people who really, I suppose, were wholesalers and distributors of his ecstasy tablets, and Medafri was one of those persons.
In 2008, police observed Pat Barbaro and his associates meeting up with greengrocer Frank Medafri near his suburban fruit shop.
What's now? What's now?
Barbaro handed Medafri boxes, which police suspected contained drugs.
Ultimately, we were able to prove that Medafri trafficked in around 57,000 ecstasy pills for Barbaro, valued at between, I think, about $1.2 and $2.2 million.
Like Barbaro, Frank Medafri's roots were back in Calabria, where he'd racked up a serious criminal record before sneaking into Australia on a tourist visa in 1989. Last week, Four Corners revealed how Frank Medafri used an extraordinary network of political donors, including his brother Tony Medafri, to lobby politicians to overturn a deportation order. Frank Medafri was allowed to stay in Australia despite Victoria police warning he was a dangerous mafia figure.
Clearly he served an apprenticeship, and a fairly violent one, in Italy before he came to Australia. Well, I think he's a significant figure. He's been involved for a very long time.
By 2008, Frank Modafferi was busy trafficking drugs supplied by Pat Barbaro. He was also issuing threats to other drug dealers who owed him money.
Vai arredo, mi porti sorda mia e non mi sono rotto i pacchi nei coglioni e ora pigliare un muffa che ne mangio. Ma che feci? Sono là di mia mamma. Io non ti chiedo quadrati, io mi ciuno e guidiamo quando vanno con i quadrati se una roba e ci siete di cose da ciuccipi. E ci dice che un profitto voglio io. Non è tu fa che ne sai, se no si mangia un cannarosso.
The Mafia syndicate used this apartment in the Melbourne suburb of Carlton as a safe house to run their drug operation.
Certainly, once we identified that Barbaro was going to rent an apartment or a townhouse in Carlton, we were really excited about that, because finally we really saw ourselves getting ahead of the game. We could actually be a part of the conversation, so we could listen in and we could hear what they were planning.
Federal police agents waited until Pat Barbaro had left the apartment before sneaking inside, planting several audio bugs and cameras. The AFP began watching and listening as Barbaro, speaking in code, discussed massive drug deals involving Frank Modafferi and other mafia figures.
What's still like?
The bug picked up Barbaro reviewing his books of account. He kept quite comprehensive books of account which related to the drug trafficking business, and that would list customers and the amount of pills that had been sold to them and the amount of money that was owed to him. So both the camera and the listening device in that unit provided very compelling evidence.
In August 2008, after months of surveillance work, the federal police team headed by Matt Warren had finally gathered enough evidence to step out of the shadows and move against the mafia bosses. In the pre-dawn darkness, heavily armed police massed at assembly points in Griffith, New South Wales, Melbourne and Adelaide, knowing some of their targets were unpredictable, armed and dangerous. At the Carlton safe house, police found these handguns buried in the garden. Inside Pat Barbaro's Griffith mansion, police found guns, drugs and cash, along with a Scarface poster.
This is part of a global international syndicate. This is a major disruption to transnational organised crime, both in this country and abroad. For the AFP, in our 30-year history, this is the largest operation we've ever undertaken.
The allegation that you, Francesco Modafferi, trafficked a substance, the substance being MDMA, and that the quantity trafficked was a commercial quantity. Do you understand that?
Ha capito questa accusa che le fanno? Yes, I understand.
What can you tell me about that allegation?
Cosa ci sta spiegando? I don't know anything about this bullshit.
When he was formally interviewed by police after his arrest, Frank Modafferi denied any involvement with Pat Barbaro's drug syndicate.
I'm trying to establish whether you owe Pasquale Barbaro $32,000.
$32,000.
No.
No.
No, you don't.
Lei ha mai acquistato delle sostanze di droga da Pasquale Barbaro? No. No.
Frank Modafferi chose to fight his drug charges. Late last year, he was convicted and received a 7-year prison sentence. Overwhelmed by the evidence against him, Pat Barbaro pleaded guilty and was jailed for 30 years over his role in the massive ecstasy shipment. At final count, 32 Mafia figures and their criminal associates were convicted for drug dealing and money laundering.
There was an importation of 100 kilos of cocaine worth $40 million. There was a conspiracy to import 100 kilos of pseudoephedrine. There was trafficking in a further 1.2 million ecstasy pills and a very sophisticated money laundering operation as well, where they turned over about $10 million.
Detective Superintendent Matt Warren and his federal police team may have smashed the syndicate behind the massive 2007 drug shipment. But the Calabrian Mafia's secretive network remains in place within Australia, able to rebuild its operations quickly.
I think that's the key to these groups. They are able to regroup, rebound after suffering, in this case, a loss that would end most organised crime syndicates. And they've had this in the past where they've suffered defeats at the hands of law enforcement. But through those family connections, they're able to rebuild.
Political influence is a key factor in the Mafia's resilience. For decades, the Mafia has been building support on both sides of politics.
Well, certainly we've seen over the years that organised crime figures will try and cultivate people of all walks of life, but particularly people with influence. We certainly see organised crime figures cultivating sporting stars. It's no different with political figures. They're looking to try and gain influence and gain power and use that towards potentially diverting attention away from themselves.
Even after he was arrested, Frank Modafferi cultivated political contacts.
Councillor wasn't on.
Victorian Labor Party delegate Michael Tetty has previously worked in the state ALP head office, as well as for federal MP Kelvin Thompson. These days, Tetty is an ALP councillor at Moreland City Council in Melbourne.
They misused our money under your watch.
Four Corners has established that Tetty spent months doing Frank Modafferi's banking and running his fruit business at the same time Modafferi was facing drug charges. While there is no suggestion Tetty was involved in drug trafficking, he allegedly supplied a gun to one of Frank Modafferi's Mafia henchmen. Tetty was later found guilty of carrying a loaded gun in a public place and placed on a good behaviour bond. Four Corners can also reveal that another Frank Modafferi associate worked in the office of then Labor Senator Mehmet Tillam. This Modafferi associate is currently facing criminal charges over a violent bashing. He got his job in the Labor Senator's office with the help of Michael Tetty. There is no suggestion that Mehmet Tillam knew that either Michael Tetty or the man he employed were associates of Frank Modafferi.
I'll cut straight to the chase. Does any political figure have any business associating with someone like Francesco Modafferi?
I would suggest that you would need to be very careful in dealings with Francesco Modafferi.
As Four Corners revealed last week, Frank Modafferi's brother Tony also has powerful political connections, despite his criminal associations. In 2008, federal police agents observed Tony Modafferi meeting Pat Barbaro and other drug traffickers on several occasions, including this gathering in the middle of a park. Tony Modafferi has never been charged with any crime and denies any wrongdoing.
What did the AFP allege to the court about the relationship between Pasquale Barbaro and Tony Modafferi?
Well, I think the allegation that we put in court and the court documents would show that they were quite close, for sure. That there was a strong association between them.
In 2013, Tony Modafferi hosted a Liberal Party fundraiser at the Docklands Reception Centre, part owned by his drug trafficking brother, Frank. The guest speaker was State Liberal Senior Minister Matthew Guy, who is now the Victorian opposition leader. Matthew Guy was unaware he was at an event hosted by an accused Mafia figure, but other Liberal figures in the room, including federal MP Russell Broadbent, knew of Modafferi's alleged Mafia connections.
I can't believe our politicians are so dopey that, having known the allegations, that they continue to accept money from the fundraiser. I find that so extremely difficult to understand how they could do it or how they could be so naive.
Victoria's Police Commissioner has made his own assessment of Tony Madaffri, recently banning him from Melbourne's Crown Casino over his alleged mafia connections.
What was your reaction when the Victorian Chief Police Commissioner banned Tony Madaffri from Crown Casino?
I wasn't surprised by that.
Why not?
Well, I think once again we see him as potentially someone who associates and has close associations with established organised crime figures, and they're not really the people that the Chief Commissioner wanted in the casino environment.
The mafia has allegedly infiltrated every layer of government. Tony Vallelonga is the former mayor of Stirling in Perth. In 2011, the news broke that Italian anti-mafia prosecutors wanted to question Vallelonga over his alleged dealings in Calabria with a notorious mafia boss. Vallelonga faced the media with his family and lawyer to vehemently deny the allegations.
It's hurted me very much. It is very distressing. At 64, to get this sort of, I would call, campaign against me. That's all it is.
The worst that can be said, assuming it was admitted, and it's not, is that Mr. Vallelonga has spoken or had contact with Italian mafia figures. Now, firstly, that's denied. We don't know which figures they are talking about.
Four Corners has learned that Italian prosecutors recently made far more detailed allegations in court about Tony Vallelonga. They allege he is an Australian mafia boss with the role of leader within his locale or mafia cell in Perth. Prosecutors allege that as part of this role, Vallelonga is responsible for making the most important decisions, for imparting orders or imposing sanctions on other subordinate associates. In a statement to Four Corners, Tony Vallelonga's lawyer said any allegation the former mayor has ever been involved in criminal activity is completely without any foundation. The Calabrian Mafia remains the dominant force in global drug trafficking. Just 3 weeks ago, Italian and Spanish police teamed up with the US Drug Enforcement Agency to launch a series of dramatic raids from the air, sea and land. Police seized tons of cocaine and arrested dozens of Calabrian Mafia figures. Despite the success, the Italian prosecutor who oversaw the operation says the 'Ndrangheta's global networks are as strong as ever.
È un colpo durissimo, però noi abbiamo bloccato oggi un'organizzazione, ma ci sono tante organizzazioni di questo livello, di questo target, che stanno operando mentre noi stiamo parlando.
Some of the suspects arrested in Calabria were members of the Italian Alvaro Mafia clan. Prosecutor Nicola Gratteri says the Alvaros have a powerful cell operating in Australia.
La famiglia Alvaro è una delle famiglie di 'Ndrangheta più importanti, presenti già dalla fine dell'Ottocento nel panorama criminale, ma penso che la 'Ndrangheta sia molto presente in Australia e che il contrasto non è adeguato, visto che queste famiglie stanno crescendo sempre più, sono sempre più forti.
One of the alleged Alvaro clan bosses in Australia is Paul Alvaro. Paul Alvaro was the man police suspected of helping Pat Barbaro import drugs into Australia back in 2007. Italian police files allege Paul Alvaro has, like Pat Barbaro, risen to become a top 'Ndrangheta figure, allegedly involved in international drug trafficking. But this was never proven, and Alvaro strongly denies any involvement in mafia activity. His only criminal conviction dates back to 1990, when he was jailed for tax offences.
The prosecution alleged the Alvaros lived grand lifestyles on the lowest of declared incomes, and that they were involved in the trafficking of marijuana.
In Calabria, where people have long endured a political system deeply infiltrated by the mafia, prosecutor Roberta De Palma has a warning for Australian authorities.
Il pericolo maggiore è fare il gioco dell''ndrangheta, cioè permettere all''ndrangheta di potersi espandere, di poter avere sempre maggiori campi di azione, sempre maggiori infiltrazioni, soprattutto in quel tessuto direttivo dirigenziale dello Stato. E poi lì diventa molto più difficile riuscire logicamente ad intervenire, perché le decisioni politiche talvolta potrebbero, io parlo in termini teorici, potrebbero addirittura essere strumento dei piani della stessa 'ndrangheta.
Anti-mafia prosecutor Nicola Gratteri says that with police worldwide now focused on terrorism, Australia cannot afford to be complacent about the hidden tentacles of the Calabrian Mafia.
Io penso che il problema mafie, il problema 'ndrangheta, è un problema che deve riguardare l'Australia e di non misurare la presenza o la forza dell''ndrangheta o delle mafie in genere dal numero dei morti ammazzati per strada o gli spari alle serrande. Capire chi rifornisce i locali di divertimento, le discoteche, i pub, chi li rifornisce di cocaina. Da dove arriva questa cocaina, chi la controlla, perché dove arriva cocaina e chi fa arrivare la cocaina, poi con quegli stessi soldi, con i guadagni di quei soldi, compra tutti gli immobili in vendita e in questo modo controlla il mercato, controlla l'economia.
The warnings from Italy resonate strongly with the man who led Australia's biggest mafia bust.
What we've seen is that these groups are very difficult to defeat. They regroup, they rebound, they reorganise. They have the international connections, which I think is a crucial part of the way they'll continue to operate. There's no question that Italian organised crime, Calabrian organised crime in this case, will continue. They will reorganise and they'll continue to conduct unlawful activity, drug importations, white-collar crime, because it's their business.
Senator Maurice Payne and MP Bruce Bilson declined to be interviewed for the program. Senator Payne said in a statement that when she made representations to the then Immigration Minister in relation to Frank Madaffri, she had no knowledge of the criminal associations of any party she dealt with. Bruce Bilson told us he was deceived about Madaffri's criminal background and was, quote unquote, bitterly disappointed about it. Amanda Vanstone and Russell Broadbent did not reply to our requests for comment. Late on Friday, we were advised by the Victorian branch of the Labor Party that it has moved to expel Michael Tetty from the party. Labor MP Kelvin Thompson has told us Tetty only worked in his office for 1 month and he had no idea of Tetty's mafia connections and supports his expulsion. Tetty declined to be interviewed for the program, but through his lawyers has denied any wrongdoing and said his relationship with Frank Madaffri was professional.